Now, before we begin, I want to just apologize for something. If this looks bad or weird or inconsistent, the real horror with this game was my attempts at trying to record it. I think I've got a little bit of my first attempt to recording. It was like a stuttery nightmare, and my computer is more than capable of handling this game and recording it at the same time. I just had a lot of extra nonsense going on with this, so I did figure it out in the end, but if stuff looks lower quality in some places than others, that was because I set the game settings to lower quality stuff just to see if that would help, and it turned out to be largely irrelevant for the recording experience, and I just kind of forgot to reset some stuff. So again, if stuff looks inconsistent, it's not the game's fault. That was my fault for trying to solve a problem that my computer was having. Anyway, thanks for your time. Tormented Souls. This was a game that I immediately by name thought was like a Dark Souls copy, and I like those games, but it's not. This was sent to the show by everyone's favorite color with 2 sets of repeated letters, Vermilion with 2 N's, under the premise, it's like classic Resident Evil. And as someone who cherishes his very, very classic version of original Biohazard, complete with 2 tyrants, a zombie Wesker, and a completely unique zombie type. Seriously, the Japanese Saturn version of that game is, like, still the best version of it. You know, I do respect Resident Evil. And having played a lot of this game, I have run into a lot of things that I think classic Resident Evil fans, warts and all, will probably like. But honestly, I have trouble seeing this game beyond its flaws, because it has numerous ones, and some of them are actually genuinely very serious. The story is, you play as, actually, I think she only says her name once in the entire game, and it's on the menu. Hold on. Caroline. Her name is Caroline. I would not have guessed that, honestly. They only refer to her once in-game, and on, like, the actual options menu below her health status heartbeat thing. Anyway, one day she receives a letter that contains a mysterious photo with some cryptic information, and then her head hurts. And then for 2 weeks she does nothing except, and this is her words, not be fine, and then she decides to go do something about it by going to where it was sent, which appears to be a hospital, mansion, might also be a church. It's kind of a weird amalgam that doesn't necessarily 100% seem to know what it wants to be, but it's mostly a hospital. Mansion. Weirdly enough, in that 2-week time, the date doesn't ever actually change. Seriously, you can check the date on your little information screen when you receive that thing, and it's like December 16th, 1994, and in-game it is still that exact same day. There's some weird timing shenanigans. She then walks in the front door, which is confusing because it has like the most obnoxious lock ever on the front door. She should not have been able to open this door, and then is promptly knocked out by a weird blur effect that I think maybe tries to make it look like something, but it's hard to tell. She then wakes up attached to a life support system in a bathtub, and you won't see any of this because nudity! And then she finds that not only is she missing 90% of her organs, but more importantly, and the only thing the story actually focuses on, her eye. And now she wants to figure out what's going on and then get out of there. I don't think you necessarily want to play this game for this story because it's very, very light. There is a lot of backstory found in logs that you can find lying around, but overall the story itself isn't terribly engaging, and unfortunately I feel like this is almost indicative of pretty much everything else in the game as well. But you will be exploring this mansion hospital thing, solving arbitrarily weird puzzles, mostly using weird-shaped keys for weird-shaped locks, very classic Resident Evil like that, and hopefully not dying to the 6 types of monsters there are. Now, I don't like this game from a writing perspective, not just because there isn't a lot of story here. The backstory that they give you is decent enough, although it feels like there should be a lot more. But they don't give you much character to work with Caroline. I just remembered her name. Again, they don't ever talk about characters. There's only one other, like, non-hostile character in the game. But what's worse is there doesn't really feel like there's too much revelation to the plot as the plot goes on, really. Because there's not really ever given time for plot so much as it more focuses on the gameplay and the combat, which I don't care for much. And the puzzles, and oh god, the puzzles. So let's talk about the puzzles. One that I think is just, let's put it this way. The best of the puzzles are weird-shaped key for weird-shaped lock. The worst sets of puzzles will make this game absolutely unplayable for some people. See, there's this one puzzle that has a door. It has a little button on it. You have to get a door knocker to hit that button because your hand isn't good enough, I guess. And you have to do it to a specific pattern. Now, I knew that. I knew that going into it. I knew the solution to this puzzle. I spent an hour on it not being able to do it. And granted, I suck at everything. I mean, I've spent almost a decade on this YouTube channel, and this is the best I've ever done at anything, and I still don't even have 2,000 subscribers. Oh, I'm sad now. But, you know, if someone has the solution and everything necessary to complete the puzzle and still can't do it, that is a failing of the puzzle design. And I don't think I'm the only one who has this problem, because I actually went to the Steam forums to see this, and there were actually quite a few people who couldn't get this puzzle to work. In fact, a lot of people seem to think that it soft-locked the game, which maybe was the case. I restarted the game and managed to do it again after a total amount of time of an hour on this one puzzle. But, you know, ignoring the fact that I suck and this puzzle might actually be broken, it's mostly just a timing thing, I think. The window for it is really unbelievably strict. But that's not even my issue with this. My issue is this will make the game impossible for some people. Because the full solution to this is to go to a statue and listen to a heartbeat with a stethoscope. Now the thing is, this is entirely done through audio, which is a problem. When I first encountered this, I realized it very quickly, but I was listening to something in the background to make it less spooky because I don't horror so well. However, if you're someone who is hearing impaired or doesn't realize this, you will never get the solution because it's not conveyed any other way. There's no accessibility options for this game. I mean, there's no subtitle option, not that there needs to be because everything's subtitled, although it doesn't match the voice acting, but that's another complaint for another day. There is no way to actually solve this problem if you can't perceive the actual pattern it does have. And if you know it, you might still not be able to do it because it's just really strictly implemented and might be outright broken. And you know what the most amazing thing about it is? Something being poorly utilized in this game could actually be properly utilized to fix this shit. Alright? See, when you take damage, your little heart monitor in your inventory speeds up. And once you take X amount of damage to put you in a more dangerous state, i.e. close to death, your little heartbeat monitor will actually be reflected in the forced feedback rumble feature of your controller. Assuming you're using a controller anyway. I do because I can't keyboard. But the thing is, it's really obnoxious here because if you alt-tab the screen, it still persists, and the only way I could deal with that was unplugging my controller at that point. But more importantly, you know, you could have had the little heartbeat puzzle answer solution thing actually, you know, transmitted through the force feedback. That way, you know, if you can't hear or you're listening to something else, you still get the solution to the puzzle. But as it stands, there's a puzzle that exists that if you don't have the ability to hear or you're just listening to something else or you're absent-minded, you're gonna completely miss this solution and the game is effectively unbeatable because you need to go through that door one way or another. I mean, again, I spent an hour knocking on that stupid thing with the proper rhythm until I actually got in. This entire puzzle is just badly designed and just outright ignores people who might want to play this game and ruins the game for them. This game straight up also just needs accessibility options in general, I think. But that's absolutely the worst of the puzzles. The best one, I guess, again, kind of goes back to weird-shaped key for weird-shaped hole, but there's a moment where you have to destroy a lock using acid, but it would take time to do that, and since time doesn't pass in this game, you have to find a way to do it retroactively. The way that happened created a really cool set piece, and honestly, that was kinda cool. But most of the puzzles at best are frustrating, and are just bad in this game, which only leaves the exploration, which is fairly standard for a game like this. Usually you take the long way around, you fight some monsters, solve a couple puzzles, you unlock a gate to give you a shortcut to an earlier part where you're gonna have to backtrack to solve something else. It's fairly unremarkable in terms of exploration, which really only leaves combat at that point, and it's not fun, but what's worse, it's slow and clunky, but it's definitely respecting the classic Resident Evil style. Ignoring enemy health anyway. Enemies take way too much damage in this game, but what really bugs me about this game is some of the encounters are just really awkward, and the way they teach you some of the combat mechanics in this game are just outright bad. Like, a lot of things are taught in the game through the use of these little clipboards that show you very quick key combinations to show how to do stuff. They're entirely optional. I kind of appreciate that, but they don't really convey much. Instead, what the game teaches you through its gameplay, which is always, I think, the most important way to teach your player, is not the best. This is the first encounter. You run into this room and the monster runs by you really quick. It's kind of nice to show you, hey, stuff's about to get real. You're about to come into your first combat encounter. It's exciting, it's creepy, they try and jump scare you with it, and it's a little weird. It's not the best jump scare ever, and that's coming from a guy who's actually like really unbelievably sensitive to jump scares thanks to audio sensitivity. But you follow him down this corridor because it's really the only way you can go, and somehow he appears behind you. It's a singular corridor and he went ahead of you, so it's not physically possible, but you know, video games. Now at this point, there's actually nothing you can do, because you don't have a weapon, and he's chasing after you, so all you really can do is run away. This is an important teachable moment because, you know, the first encounter teaches you that, hey, running away is not only a viable strategy, sometimes it's going to be necessary. I mean, it's really not. They kind of throw that logic out the window pretty quick, but either way, the way they teach you that running away is important through kind of forcing you to, that's clever. It's well done. Good job, game. You had a good teachable moment that taught something to your player intelligently. Thumbs up. And that's about as positive as I get from how this game teaches and its combat. Because in the next room, the moment you enter, you hit a cutscene that provides you with a gun. And then you solve a puzzle and you go fight that thing again, and you know, that sounds all well and good, except that I've kind of skipped over some stuff because this is kind of my first experience with this. It was, you get a gun, you do some puzzle stuff, you go fight the thing. And immediately after this, I came to the conclusion that was actively wrong about combat. Because the first enemy you encounter takes about 7 shots to knock down. It was at this point that I thought, hey, I won because it took so much ammo. Hooray for me. Except then I saw him move, and part of the problem here was that the camera angle was placed in such a weird, awkward spot that you couldn't really see what you were doing because this game tried to, again, focus on fixed camera angles, which is certainly a blessing and a curse at times. So the first actual combat encounter, what I learned was you can't really kill enemies, you can only temporarily incapacitate them. So I ran away, because as established, the game teaches you running away works. Okay, except that's wrong, you can kill them. It takes like 7 shots with your weapon, and then 2 melee attacks. But wait, I didn't even realize I had a melee weapon. And this is something that the game doesn't really teach you, and it does it really badly. Now, maybe I'm just dumb, because in the room where you get a gun, there's also a crowbar, so, you know, maybe that's obvious to you, but the thing about it that's really, really bad is the order in which these events take place. The first thing you do when you enter this room is you get a cutscene, where a priest gives you a gun, and then says use this to defend yourself. You are actively being told, this is for self-defense, this is how you fight. The crowbar at this point is not ever actually actively acknowledged as a combat tool, or indeed, beyond picking it up and then used immediately afterwards, it's never even acknowledged as an item. In order to progress, you then have to find a crowbar, which is your melee weapon, and then proceed to turn around and use it to open a door, which in my head came across as weird-shaped key for weird-shaped lock, which this game does a lot of, and then I thought there was no further use to this. And part of the reason why I think this is in literally the first room of the game, you get a pipe wrench which could equally be used to physically defend yourself as a melee weapon, except you use it to open a door, exactly like you use the crowbar. So I'm just working with the established rules the game has given me at this point, that this isn't for actually fighting, it's just used to remove a simple barrier and then move on. That is what this game taught me. When in actuality, you keep your crowbar and then have to use it as a melee weapon, which the game doesn't remotely teach you. You're just supposed to infer it, and maybe that's obvious. But to me, I didn't see it that way. If I were designing this game and making this particular series of events, what I would do would be to have your character enter the room and be presented with a barrier that they have to destroy with the crowbar. This requires your character to then go to a secondary room and pick up the crowbar, which would then spawn a monster that is unable to actually attack or move. You know, it's injured, it just lets you get some practice in using your weapon. You then pick up your gun in the next room from the priest, who then tells you to use this to defend yourself. That way, you have experience using it as both a weapon and as whatever you need it to do to deal with that, instead of just picking it up and thinking it's something you need to just use to deal with the barrier. But, you know, maybe I'm just dumb. I'm willing to accept that I'm dumb, fine. But you know what's worse than not teaching your player, like, how to play? When you actively stack the deck against them, like, immediately afterwards. Very early on, I was actually forced to reset the game over and over and over because of what is literally the second encounter in the game. Well, ultimately, it's not that bad an encounter. It is a terrible second encounter for a player who's still just getting their feet wet with the blood of their enemies, trying to get a handle on how to take enemies out, especially, again, if we're working with the knowledge that we can't actually kill things. I mean, we can, but if my first encounter with the first enemy I was given told me we can't, I kind of had to work around that logic. And yeah, I did, because the next encounter is not of one, but two enemies in confined space right in front of the save room. And here's where things kind of got bad. See, saving in this game is similar to the original Resident Evil or Biohazard, a manageable resource. You can only save so many times, and only if you have a certain item used as a resource to save. So you gotta time your saves properly. I had held on to my saves because, well, I just got my weapon, I spent a little bit of time here, and I just wanted to save for, you know, safety. So I didn't have to go through like the 20 minutes that led up to this. I think that's totally respectable. So I enter the room that's right outside where the save is, and I find these two monsters in this really confined space. It's basically a narrow path. And it's 2-on-1. This is the second encounter. I think that's a bit of a ramp up, but what's worse is if you were to take this encounter logically and use the thin corridor that starts the room as a bottleneck to take these enemies out, you're basically dead because these monsters have a ranged attack. So if you focus on one enemy, suddenly the other one comes at you. I died here, and I had to restart the game. So, second time I had to do this, I'm working with the logic that I've already learned from the first encounter, which is, don't fight things, just run if you can. So I did, and I got to the save point, and all was well. And I saved. And then I left, and I found that the monster was right outside the door and killed me before I had control of my character. Yeah, if you leave stuff alive in this game, they will, like, puppy guard doors that you go through and wait for you to come out and kill you before you have any control of your character. That's not great. In fact, I outright thought I kind of soft-locked the game because I saved prior, and I kind of did until I restarted the game, which kind of resets enemy placement. At least, living enemy placement. Dead enemies stay exactly where you left them killed, which is actually a pretty cool feature. I like that. The way this game first teaches you to handle opponents is to basically avoid conflict whenever possible, and yet the enemies are designed to hound you in such a way that you can't do it. It feels like the concept of the enemy tactics and what you should be doing to survive best are completely diametrically opposed, and there's a lot of just cheapness that stacks the deck against you. Now, that said, that encounter is actually not that hard, and when we realize you can actually kill things entirely just by dumping a stupid amount of ammo in it, and using the in-menu auto-loading, seriously, you can load your weapon in the menu, which completely defeats the 10 seconds it takes to actually load your weapon in a fight. You should abuse the hell out of that, by the way. Suddenly it's not that bad. But the fact that I was put in a situation like that because of the way the game teaches its mechanics and its encounters, and the way that the encounters are designed to basically make your life a living hell, even if the enemies aren't really designed terribly intelligently, they just kind of come straight at you. You know, it just didn't feel fun. And even when I got past that, because like I said, that encounter really isn't all that bad, it's just a really terrible second encounter, especially if you haven't saved, and that's the only way to save at that point. You know, once you get past that, combat doesn't get better. Not in the sense that it feels horribly stacked against you or anything, it's just kind of boring, honestly. Like, all the monsters kind of just charge straight at you, and there aren't too many of them. I think there's like 6. By the time you get like your second weapon, you've already run into pretty much all of them, which means that at this point, all you really have to worry about is using your second weapon to pretty much one-shot everything. Yeah, the enemies aren't terribly brilliant in this game, and I think for a horror game, what's worse is they're not that scary, but I want to talk about that more in presentation. The fact is, though, encounters are at best kind of tedious and clumsy, and I think part of that's just trying to be like classic Resident Evil, but I think that excuse is also something of a crutch this game tries to use to not have more engaging combat. Because ultimately, when you do realize how simple it is to actually take enemies out, the only thing that's really stopping you is clumsiness and the fact they have a lot more health than you. I think during that second encounter, the enemy could hit me 3 times and I would die, and I'd have to hit the enemy about 6 or 7 times. Enemies have a ridiculous amount of health, and there isn't a lot of healing items in this game. Like saves and like ammo, it's a very manageable resource, which is good for the horror bit, but it just doesn't feel fun, especially when all the clumsiness is involved. The only time I found combat to be really all that enjoyable was the moment I realized I could auto-reload in menu and save myself a whole lot of time and damage. And when your solution to make gameplay a lot more fun is to basically probably cheat, that's not the best thing. I think that at the end of the day, gameplay-wise, this game relies on it trying to be a lot like classic Resident Evil. And like I said, it uses that as a bit of a crutch. It's not bad, and if you're a fan of those kind of games, especially the older style ones, and are able to look past the awkwardness, you can probably find some fun here. But at the same time, I could see a lot of flaws here. I could see the clumsiness, I could see the awkwardness, I could see some of the unfair battles and some of the poorly made encounters. I saw a lot of repetitive enemies and not really all that many weapons or really different ways to handle combat. It was literally, oh, there's an enemy, they're charging straight at me, I'm gonna shoot you a whole bunch, oh, you're dead. That's basically every fight in this game. The only time it's not that is when you are left in a darkened area and you can't see them, because this game has an instant kill dark mechanic where the Gru gets you. Except outside of like the very beginning before you get your light source, it's never really used. Like, ostensibly, it's used a lot around every encounter, but every singular encounter around those enemies, they still place candles that you can light up and stand in and shoot. So they kind of immediately threw that concept out the window as well. So we can mark that as another really poorly utilized mechanic they had. Tormented Souls, at its core, is not perfect. If you like older horror games, if you like the clumsiness and the awkwardness of classic Resident Evil, you might find some fun here. But there is certainly a lot of problems here, and if the combat doesn't get very, very dull and repetitive, if not downright annoying, the puzzles might very well kill it for you. The overall presentation to Tormented Souls fares a fair bit better, at least visually, sort of. The environmental design is awesome. I think that if you go back to how I said that I wasn't really scared of monsters, it wasn't that I wasn't even scared. I was scared of the environments and the set pieces they set up, but the monsters themselves, yeah, they weren't terribly scary. And part of it is, I think, something they did to sort of make them look more scary. Going back to the opening cutscene where you see the first monster, they have like this weird, unnatural, like, jittering animation that I think is supposed to be like scary, and I found that comical. Like, seriously, and bear in mind, I'm a total wuss who can't handle horror of like any capacity. I was laughing at these monsters. Like, it's a knife-handed thing that's chasing me, and it has the most horrifying sound effects when you hear it. And yet when you see it, it's just kind of look at that. It's got that weird jitter animation. It looks like the animation broke or something on it, and they just thought, hey, that looks creepy, let's use it. And, you know, if that's the case, bravo for them trying to use something like that, but it just doesn't look scary at all, really. But like I said, the environments and the set pieces they've designed, those are genuinely creepy. The moment where I ran into what was kind of like the first boss of the game, and the fact that you have to like sort of summon him, the process of doing that was absolutely terrifying. Boss went down really, really quick, but still, I was on the edge of my seat. Hearing the sound effects of, you know, the wheelchair enemies that drag themselves with their big heavy knife hands across the floor, that loud metallic clanging sound, that was terrifying. Whenever I was in an area with them, no joke, I would sit in a corner and wait for them to come to me because I didn't know where they were coming from. That scared the pants off me. But that said, you know, your character doesn't look that great and her animations are very, very stiff. And straight up, the lighting and use of shadows punches well above their weight class in this game. I am genuinely floored about the lighting and shadows in this game. Really well done, very impressive. And audio-wise, the voice acting is just outright bad, and not in the sort of fun camp way that classic Resident Evil had. It's just not good here. I mean, on the bright side, there's not that many voiced characters, but it's still bad, and the voice acting doesn't match the subtitles. When you don't have that much dialogue, you should probably make sure that matches up properly. Just saying. And it's not an occasional thing. It's like every other dialogue box has something that doesn't match up properly. Like, the intent of the message is still delivered through the voice acting, it's just, it's not an accurate subtitling at all. Which is, really, like I said, when you don't have that much to actually subtitle, not great. And the soundtrack was relatively spooky. I quite enjoyed it for the horror-iness. Like I said, at one point I had to play with something else in the background just so I could get past the horror-iness of this because, again, I'm a bit of a wimp. Overall, I think the presentation, when it hits hard. But its misses become even more apparent, and like everything else in the game, they just kind of draw attention to how they fall flat, I think. Now, if you want a copy of Tormented Souls on Steam, it appears to be about $23, which feels a little bit high, especially when I can see the problems this game has. If you are interested in this game, I would say wait for a sale, because if you are into these sort of games, if you're into the classic Resident Evil, and to a lesser extent the Silent Hill games, or at least the good ones, you know, you're gonna find fun here maybe, but there's a good chance you're also gonna find equal parts frustration and perhaps even a realization of why we moved away from the clumsiness of the classic style to what we have now. But I have to give a huge shout out and thank you once again to everyone's favorite color with 2 sets of repeated letters, Vermilion with 2 N's. He sent this to me, and I gotta say, I was genuinely scared with some of the bits of this game, but at other times, it was just more frustrating than it was scary or fun or engaging. And some of the ways this game tries to teach its mechanics to its players, some of its enemy encounters, the puzzle designs, it's gonna be frustrating for some people, if not downright making this game unplayable. So it's important going into this game recognizing that it's pretty far from perfect. I think if you can look past the rough aspect of the encounters, the jank, the very clumsy controls that kind of come with the territory, whether, again, that's being used as an excuse or not, being irrelevant, if you can look past the somewhat samey encounters and just want sort of a harkening back to classic horror, you might enjoy this game. But I would still recommend that you find this game on sale because $23 does seem a tad high for this game. But that said, while this game can be frustrating, soft-locking, and in some cases just cheaply or badly designed, it does have its moments, and if you're willing to wade through that, you might just find your next favorite horror game.